The women who surrendered hoping for mercy were sorted before the blood dried. That is the detail every textbook about the Mongol Empire quietly skips. Not what they conquered, not how fast they moved, but what happened in the hours after the walls came down, and to whom. The Mongol Empire is remembered as history's great connector, the largest contiguous land empire ever assembled, a civilization that linked China to Europe, opened trade routes, enabled the movement of ideas across half the world. Historians call it the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. What they say less often is what that peace was built on, who paid for it, whose names were never written down. Between 1206 and 1260, the Mongol war machine consumed more than 40 major cities, killed somewhere between 30 and 40 million human beings, roughly 11% of the entire world population at that time, and generated a slave trade network so extensive, so organized, and so profitable that it outlasted the empire itself by 600 years. And at the center of that system, driving its expansion, feeding its logistics, and sustaining its economy, was the systematic capture and commodification of women, on a scale that had no precedent in human history. This is not a story about distant statistics. Every number you are about to hear had a face, a name someone used to call them, a city they grew up in, a life that ended or was permanently shattered on a specific afternoon in a specific field outside a specific set of broken walls. Before we go any further, if you are someone who wants the real history, the parts that are hard to say and harder to hear, the truth behind the monuments and the empire-building mythology, subscribe and join us here. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are watching from, because this story deserves to be told properly, and that is exactly what we are going to do. It started with one man, born around 1162 in the Khenti Mountains of northern Mongolia, a nobody named Temujin who grew up eating roots and rats after his father was poisoned and his clan abandoned his family in the middle of winter. He was 9 years old. He had no protection, no allies, no resources, and no reason to believe he would survive. The empire Genghis built operated on a system of incentive and terror that was more deliberate, more structured, and more coldly rational than most empires that came before it. Cities that opened their gates and submitted received protection. Their populations were absorbed. Their skilled workers were cataloged and redistributed. Their trade routes were kept open. But cities that chose to fight, that killed Mongol soldiers or refused Mongol messengers or broke their promises of submission received something different, something designed not just to punish but to send a message to the next city on the list. The message was simple: resistance means annihilation. And annihilation, in the Mongol system, was not chaos, it was process. Here is what almost every account of the Mongol conquests gets wrong. The violence was not the point. The violence was the advertisement. What actually drove the empire forward was the sorting that came after the violence. The cold, organized division of surviving human beings into categories of usefulness. Blacksmiths went one direction. Doctors went another. Engineers were separated from merchants, children of a certain age were pulled aside for specific purposes, and women were assessed, ranked, and distributed according to a hierarchy that ran from the Great Khan's personal collection all the way down to roadside caravan stations serving traveling merchants along the Silk Road. This was not improvised, it was policy, encoded in practice, repeated across dozens of campaigns, and understood by every commander who rode under the Mongol banner. The process began the moment the walls came down. Surviving residents were marched out of the city onto an open field. Mongol soldiers worked the rows methodically. Skilled workers, anyone who could build, repair, record, or heal, were pulled to one side and marked for relocation. They would be sent to Karakorum, the Mongol capital, or distributed to wherever the empire needed their particular skill. They were property, but useful property, and useful property was treated with a degree of care. Everyone else entered a different calculation. For women, the assessment was explicit and physical. Mongol commanders walked through the rows and selected. Youth first, then appearance. The standards were specific. Persian historians who witnessed these selections wrote about them in detail, with a combination of horror and the clinical precision of people who had survived by writing down exactly what they saw. Commanders selected first for high-ranking officers and nobility. The most prized selections were reserved for presentation to the Great Khan himself. Genghis Khan's personal preferences were documented by the Persian court historians who served at the Mongol court. He had very specific tastes. He favored small noses, long dark hair, rounded figures, soft voices. His personal collection, by the time of his later campaigns, numbered in the hundreds, and this was considered, by the standards of the empire he was building, the best possible outcome for a captured woman. What happened to women who were not selected by the top tier was considerably worse. Women deemed attractive but not chosen by senior commanders were distributed down the military hierarchy as rewards. Successful soldiers received them. Officers traded them to build loyalty between units, to cement alliances between clans, to repay debts of honor and obligation. A single city of 100,000 people could produce thousands of women who were allocated across an entire Mongol army, from generals to foot soldiers, according to rank and performance in battle. And the women who were not selected by anyone in the military, they entered the trade network. The Mongol Empire, as it expanded west and south, established a series of caravanserais, roadside stations positioned along the Silk Road and its tributary routes, where merchants, traders, and traveling officials could rest, resupply, and conduct business. Women captured during the conquests were posted to these stations as permanent residents. They had no rights, no legal standing, no mechanism for appeal or escape. Their purpose was explicit and singular, and the Persian and Chinese and Arabic chronicles that recorded this period described it with a directness that is difficult to read 8 centuries later. Some of these women had been daughters of governors, wives of scholars, sisters of military officers, nieces of caliphs. The social standing they had occupied before the walls fell meant nothing in the sorting field. The moment their city surrendered or was taken by force, their identity was erased. The system did not recognize them as people, it recognized them as inventory. But the sorting field was only the beginning. The empire also needed a way to move this inventory across thousands of miles of conquered territory, and to connect supply with demand across a network that stretched from the Chinese frontier to the ports of the Black Sea. What the Mongols built, partly deliberately, partly by the gravity of conquest, was the most extensive human trafficking infrastructure the medieval world had ever produced. Cities like Bukhara, Karakoram, and Sarai became major trading hubs where captured people were bought, sold, and shipped, like goods along the same routes that carried silk and spices. Women taken during the sack of one city could end up in a market 3,000 miles away within months. Christian women were sold into Muslim markets. Muslim women were shipped to Christian ones. The system did not care about religion, nationality, language, or age. And here's the thing about systems. Once they are built and profitable, they do not stop when the people who built them are gone. The slave trade networks the Mongol Empire constructed during its peak campaigns continued operating centuries after the empire fractured and collapsed. The market at Bukhara, established during the height of the conquests, kept running all the way into the 1870s. 600 years of continuous operation, fed originally by the sorting fields outside the broken walls of cities that no longer existed. Now pause here, because this is the point where most history content moves quickly past the human reality and back to troop movements and casualty numbers. We are not going to do that, because the individual stories are what make the scale of this comprehensible. Nishapur, 1221. Nishapur was one of the great cities of the Silk Road. It sat at the crossroads of trade routes connecting Central Asia to Persia to the wider Islamic world. Its population numbered somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 people. It had libraries, markets, mosques. Scholars traveled from across the known world to study there. The poet Attar of Nishapur, one of the foundational voices of Persian literature, a man whose work would go on to influence Persian culture for centuries, lived there. He was in his late 70s when the Mongols came. The first time Mongol forces passed through the region, under Generals Jebe and Subutai, Nishapur had cooperated. They handed over food and supplies. The Mongols moved on. The city survived. The people of Nishapur exhaled. Then rumors spread that the Mongols had suffered a defeat somewhere further east. The city grew bold. Resistance began to organize, and during a second Mongol assault on the surrounding region, a single arrow flew from the top of Nishapur's walls and struck a Mongol general named Tokochar through his armor. He died on the spot. Here is the detail that changed everything. Tokochar was not just a general. He was married to Chechegen, Genghis Khan's own daughter. When Chechegen received word that her husband was dead, she did not grieve quietly. She sent a message to her father with a single request: the complete and total destruction of every living thing in the city. Every man, every woman, every child, every animal. She wanted it done personally, and she wanted to be there to watch. Genghis Khan agreed. He sent his son Tolui to carry it out with a single instruction: grant her wish. Tolui arrived with a force estimated between 10,000 and 80,000 soldiers, depending on the source you trust. The siege lasted 3 days. When the walls collapsed, the killing... Chechigan sat on the field and watched the entire operation. She was there to make sure nobody was missed. Nobody was spared. Nobody's status or age or condition earned an exemption. When the killing was done, the heads were separated into 3 pyramids. One for the men, one for the women, one for the children. A cleric who survived spent 13 straight days counting. He arrived at a figure above 1.3 million. Modern historians believe the real number was somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000. Even at the lower estimate, that is an entire city, gone, erased in under a week. Among the dead was Attar of Nishapur. He was cut down at nearly 80 years old. Centuries of literary tradition died with him on that field. After the massacre, Tolui sent soldiers back into the ruins to hunt for survivors who might be hiding underground or beneath the bodies. When they were satisfied that the city was empty, they planted barley over the wreckage. One of the jewels of the Islamic world became a crop field. No monument, no grave, just grain growing where a civilization used to be. The women of Nishapur who were not killed in the initial massacre did not escape. They entered the sorting system, the same system that had processed the captured women of every city the Mongols had ever taken. The pyramid of their severed heads was the only monument the empire left behind. Their names went with them into the network and disappeared. But Nishapur was not an exception. That same year, they came for Merv. Merv sat in what is now modern Turkmenistan. It was not just a city, it was a center of civilization. 10 libraries, an estimated 150,000 books collected over centuries. Scholars from every corner of the Islamic world came to study there. Astronomers, physicians, philosophers. The walls around Merv were 15 feet thick and 30 feet high. The people of Merv believed they were safe behind those walls. When Tolui's army arrived, the governor of Merv made a calculation. He had seen what happened at Nishapur. He knew that fighting...
He broke that promise within hours. The population was marched out of the city and sorted on the open plain. The executions began at sunrise. A Persian chronicler who survived described that day as filled with shrieking and weeping from dawn until dark, a detail that stayed in the written record because the sound of it was impossible to convey in any other way. Some people were brought out in groups of 20 and drowned in troughs that had already been filled with the blood of the people before them. Contemporary accounts put the death toll at Mer at 700,000 or more. The 10 libraries and their 150,000 books were burned. The women and children who survived the slaughter entered the trade network and vanished into it, shipped east and west through a system that had no interest in where they had come from. The system was working exactly as designed.
Now here is where the story takes a turn that most histories of the Mongol Empire do not adequately reckon with. Because the worst recorded act of organized violence against women under Mongol rule was not committed against enemies. It was not committed against Persians or Arabs or Russians or Chinese. It was committed against the Mongols' own people. In 1237, a decade after Genghis Khan died, his son Ogedei sat on the throne. Ogedei had inherited the largest empire in human history and had none of his father's discipline. He was an alcoholic who drank so heavily that his own brother Chagatai was alarmed enough to send a personal physician to monitor him and limit him to a single cup of alcohol per day. Ogedei solved this problem by commissioning a cup built to twice the normal size. He thought this was very clever. The Oirat people were a Mongol tribe from the Altai mountain region. They had been governed by Cheche Gen, the same woman who had ordered the destruction of Nishapur, until her death. After her death, Ogedei wanted their territory and their people under his direct control. When the Oirat failed to send the expected tribute of young women for his personal collection, Ogedei ordered a response that made even the most battle-hardened Persian chroniclers struggle to find language for what they were obligated to record. He ordered 4,000 Oirat girls, some as young as 7 years old, to be gathered on an open field. Their fathers, their brothers, their husbands were ordered to attend. Girls from noble families were pulled to the front of the assembly, and then, one by one, Ogedei's soldiers assaulted them while their male relatives were forced to stand there and watch. No one was permitted to speak. No one was permitted to move. The silence was part of the punishment. 2 of the girls died during the course of that day. The survivors were divided. Some went to Ogedei's personal collection. Others were sent to the caravanserai network that ran across the empire's trade routes. The ones considered unfit for either purpose were left on the field for anyone who wanted them. The Persian historians who had written about rivers of blood and mountains of skulls without losing their composure could barely find the words for this event. They called the girls star-like maidens and described their horror in language that was still visibly constrained by the paralysis of what they were documenting. Even the Mongol historians, men whose professional purpose was to celebrate the achievements of their rulers, described this event in vague and carefully distanced language because the shame of it was too heavy to put down directly. You can feel it in the writing, even in translation. The effort to record what happened and simultaneously to look away from it. This violated everything Genghis Khan had built. The Yasa, the great Mongol legal code, the foundational law of the empire, had specifically prohibited the kidnapping, force-taking, and sale of women.
This was not an accident or a marginal provision. Under Genghis, women in Mongol society had exercised real, documented power. His wife Borte had governed the empire during his prolonged absences on campaign. His daughters had administered vast territories along the Silk Road with the full authority of appointed governors. Mongol women rode horses, carried bows, and commanded soldiers. Some historians believe as many as 1 in 5 fighters in the early Mongol army may have been women.
When Genghis died in 1227, those protections died with him. His sons and grandsons fought each other for control of the territories they inherited. Female relatives who governed valuable land were killed by their own cousins to seize what they governed. The legal code that had given Mongol women legal standing under their own ruler was treated as inconvenient by the men who came after. The empire that had built its founding mythology partly on the capable, protected, empowered Mongol woman had, within a single generation, turned that woman into the same category of property it created everywhere else it conquered. The empire consumed the women of Nishapur and Merv and 100 cities between them, and then it consumed its own. Baghdad, 1258. When Hulagu Khan, another grandson of Genghis, commanding an army estimated at over 100,000 soldiers, marched to the gates of Baghdad, he was arriving at the center of the Islamic world. Baghdad had been the intellectual and cultural capital of a civilization for over 500 years. Its house of wisdom held manuscripts from every intellectual tradition the medieval world had produced: Greek, Persian, Indian, Arab, astronomers, mathematicians, physicians, poets, philosophers. The great library was not just a collection of books, it was the accumulated work of centuries of human inquiry, preserved and organized and built upon by successive generations. The Caliph al-Mustasim believed the city's symbolic status would protect it. The spiritual center of Islam, he calculated, was too significant to destroy. He refused to surrender. He was wrong about everything. The siege lasted 12 days. Chinese engineers attached to the Mongol army operated catapults and battering rams designed specifically to crack walls that had been standing for generations. Canals were diverted to weaken the city's foundations. By early February of 1258, the Mongols controlled an entire section of the wall. The Caliph tried to negotiate. Hulagu refused. On February 10th, Baghdad officially surrendered. The Mongols waited 3 more days before entering. 3 days of silence while the population remained behind fallen walls, not knowing what was coming. When the soldiers finally walked through the gates on February 13, 1258, they spent an entire week killing, burning, and destroying without pause. The population of Baghdad at the time was approximately 1 million people. Estimates of the dead range from 90,000 on the conservative end to over 800,000 at the high end. Contemporary sources, who had no reason to minimize what they were recording, described the Tigris River running red with blood for 3 days.
Then it turned black, with the ink of hundreds of thousands of destroyed manuscripts that the soldiers threw into the water. Eyewitness accounts describe soldiers crossing the river on the backs of ruined texts. The Caliph, the spiritual leader of the entire Muslim world, was forced to watch his people die before the Mongols wrapped him in a carpet and had horses trample him to death. They killed his family. 2 exceptions. 1 son was shipped to Mongolia. 1 daughter was taken as a personal concubine for Hulagu's collection. The women and children of Baghdad who survived the initial slaughter were processed through the same sorting system that had been operating for 50 years across half the known world. Shipped to markets in Azerbaijan, Mongolia, Crimea, allocated through the network, distributed to endpoints that the historical record almost entirely does not follow them to.
In total, the Mongol conquests killed somewhere between 30 and 40 million people, 11% of the entire world's population at that time. If the same proportion died today, that would be equivalent to roughly 880 million people. The population of Persia alone dropped from an estimated 2.5 million to 250,000 during the campaigns, a 90% collapse. Entire regions that had sustained human civilization for 1,000 years were reduced to empty wasteland inside a single generation. The slave trade networks the Mongol Empire built did not die with the empire. The market at Bukhara, established at the height of the conquest, continued operating for another 600 years, all the way into the 1870s. The infrastructure of human capture, transport, and sale that the Mongols constructed proved, in the end, more durable than the empire itself. And in every city across those 6 decades of conquest, the pattern repeated. The walls came down, the people were marched to the field, the skilled workers were separated, the men were killed, and the women were assessed, ranked, and moved into a system designed from the ground up to treat them as permanent, transferable, disposable property. The Mongol Empire is real history. The trade routes it established are real. The administrative innovations it pioneered across the breadth of Asia are real. The Pax Mongolica is a documented historical phenomenon with genuine consequences for the development of the connected world. None of that is mythology, but underneath that peace was a foundation built on the lives of people who never asked to be part of any of it. Women who had been scholars and daughters and wives and rulers, whose identities were erased on a field outside a broken city wall and replaced with a single classification in a system that could not see them as people. They left no monuments, no inscriptions, no grave markers. The empire they were absorbed into recorded its conquests in meticulous detail: troop counts, battle formations, casualty numbers, tribute collected. It did not record their names. It did not record what happened to them after the sorting. It recorded what was useful to the empire, and they were only ever useful as inventory. What remains is the silence, 800 years of it. And the silence is the most honest thing the historical record has left to say about what it actually cost to build the largest empire